You have stepped into Reader's Labyrinth. And here is your host, Frank Schumpert.
Hey there, if you're watching this on YouTube, please give it a like and hit that subscribe button. It helps me reach a wider audience. Thanks for stopping by. Hey there. Please welcome Dr. Vyvyan Evans, language expert, digital communication technologist, as well as fiction and nonfiction author. Dr. Evans is an expert in language and digital communication, and in his writing and research, he likes to explore the language and mind and the relationship between the two. He is the author of several books on language, non-linguistic communication, meaning, mind, imagination, their evolution, the impact of technology on language and the future of language and communication. You can find him discussing these topics and more on a regular basis in broadcast media, to include TV and podcast appearances. He has a regular column in Psychology Today called Language in the Mind. You can also find his blog, Language Creates, and in his popular science writing, which is found across multimedia platforms. The reason why Dr. Evans is joining me today is because he is the author of a wonderful fiction book called The Babel Apocalypse, a genre-blending dystopian sci-fi mystery thriller that will make you think about language in a whole new way. Today, Dr. Evans joins me, not so much to talk about his novel that's coming up soon, and as all of my readers are aware, I like to sit down and at least be able to read the story of an author before I speak with them. However, Dr. Evans reached out to me across Twitter, and I was just very, very impressed with him. What follows is a wonderful rabbit hole where I sit and listen as he lets me know about language, thought, and time. And oh boy, what a wonderful exploration this is. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Evans into the Labyrinth.
This is a book about language. It's set about 100 years, just over 100 years in the future, where language is no longer learned. There are no native speakers of language anymore. It's taking the idea of language streaming. We have language chips in our heads, with the downstream consequences that happen because of this in terms of how language is learned or not learned, and big tech corporations owning language. And because of this, and on my background, I'm an academic linguist and a cognitive scientist. I have a PhD in linguists. I spent nearly 20 years teaching language and how the mind works as a professor of linguistics. My PhD is from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And because of this, the book has a lot of different languages in it. There's a discussion of language and an exploration of language. And there are characters that speak different languages in the book. Some invented languages, some real languages. So there are characters that speak Romanian, French, Dutch, different varieties of English, including different varieties of North American English, British English, and invented varieties of English that may exist in the future.
Your book sounds so fascinating. I cannot wait to get my copy of it in the mail. I'm going to be ordering myself a copy. And it sounds really, really neat. Well, so I'm really interested in your background then. So you clearly have a background in languages. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, if you don't mind?
Sure, yeah. I started off in my early 20s as a language teacher. So I was trained in teaching English as a foreign language with various qualifications, and I worked in France as an English language teacher and then in South Korea. And through happenstance, a twist of fate, I ended up in Florida and did a master's degree in linguistics at the University of Florida. And then from there, I was lucky enough to earn a scholarship to do a PhD in linguistics at Georgetown University. And then I got a job as a professor, assistant professor of linguistics back in the UK. And I spent the next 16 or 17 years working as a professor of linguistics. I began publishing. My writing career began with technical books on language, developing theories of how we process language, how we use things like what are called conceptual metaphors in language, which reveal things about the human mind. So I'll just give you a quick aside for you and your listeners so you understand exactly what this entails. So if we want to understand how we think about abstract concepts like times, nothing much more abstract than time, in the sense that it's not something you can see like trees and rocks and mountains. It's something that we feel and we experience. Each time we, in the passing of days and weeks and months, we look at our reflections in the mirror, and we understand events passing in time and so on. We can use language. I'm what's called a cognitive linguist, so I use language as a means of studying, as kind of a laboratory to study how the mind organizes information, the concepts and ideas that give life to our lives, and how we make sense of the world around us. So if we take something like time, if I said to you, the Easter Bunny is round the corner, or Christmas is coming, no one gets confused and think, the Easter Bunny's around the corner, or Easter's around the corner. If I said Easter's around the corner, you don't get confused and think, if I walk around the corner, I'm going to actually see the Easter Bunny. Or if I say to a kid, Christmas is coming, that they think Father Christmas is going to knock on the door in a minute. We understand that when we use these everyday expressions in English, a language like English, that when we talk about coming, we're using space, motion through space, and elements placed and situated in space as a means of understanding how time works. Because we can't see time, we use aspects of our embodied experience, or spatial experience, our everyday experiences of walking around and banging into things in the world, to structure time, to structure the concepts so that we could handle it and actually think about it using these kind of more concrete spatial markers. And then the thing that's interesting about time is that something like time is that it then turns out that other languages do things in remarkably different ways. So there's an American Indian, a native indigenous language called Aymara, spoken in parts of South America. And in that language, rather than the future being situated spatially in front, they wouldn't say, I can see the face of things to come, which is a kind of a hackneyed common expression in English. For Aymara speakers, culturally and linguistically, the future is located behind and the past is located in front. And the reason for that is they use a conceptual metaphor to structure it, in which the conceptual metaphor is knowing is seeing. So when we say things, I see what you mean, we don't literally see what someone means. You use the concept of vision to structure what knowing and knowledge is like, because when you see something, you know it. So from this perspective, what the Aymara do, which is really super cool, is because the past hasn't yet come, or the past has come rather, future hasn't come. Now I'm confusing myself. You see how confusing this is? Because the future hasn't yet come, it's behind because you can't see it yet. Whereas the past is located ahead because you can see it. So the idea is in English.
Okay.
So in English, we talk about Christmas coming or Easter coming, or she hasn't got over her divorce, so the divorce is in the past, located in the past, so it's behind. So we talk about temporal things using motion through space, whereas Aymara think about the speakers of that particular language. You said you wanted a highbrow conversation, Frank, so I'm taking your
This is it. Yeah, sure. Let's do it. Come on. I am all game for this.
In Aymara, they use the metaphor of knowing is seeing, so the vision metaphor to structure time, not the spatial motion metaphor, which we do in English, no matter which variety of your English you happen to speak, British, my stiff-assed variety, or your sweet dulcet American tones. So you have these organizational differences that crop up. So you're asking me about my background. So this is by way of explaining some of the research that I undertook, and I wrote these technical books on on how the mind works using language as a laboratory. And from that, then it was a natural step to start writing textbooks for students of language and mind that are used in many English-speaking universities in North America and the UK. And then from there, I branched out into popular science books. So I wrote a book that caused a big controversy back in 2014 called The Language Myth. And this rebuts the prevailing theory held by language scientists that language is some kind of instinct, that we're kind of born with the rudiments of language. This is developed by a very famous guy called Noam Chomsky. He's probably more famous for his political views than language, and has been peddled by in popular science by Steven Pinker, who's a well-known public intellectual. So I wrote this book called The Language Myth that rebutted this kind of view and explained that, in fact, language derives from experience. It's not an instinct as such. That's the wrong kind of metaphor. And then from there I developed and wrote the first popular science treatment of emoji as a system of communication, using language science to understand how this new form. I got going with this in 2015, trying to understand the significance of emoji as a system of communication. And this came about because back in 2015, that was really the year that emoji as a system of communication went mainstream. I mean, now we sort of take it all for granted, but it really went mainstream that year. There was a case where a 17-year-old African-American in Brooklyn posted 3 police officer emojis with pistols pointing at these officers. And this young man posted this in a public status update on Facebook, and then an arrest warrant was subsequently issued under the 9/11 statutes that were introduced after 9/11 in New York. And the guy was arrested for an alleged terroristic threat. And no one knew what to make of this. And someone from the Guardian newspaper contacted me and asked me if I'd be willing. They couldn't find any experts who knew anything about emoji. And the question was, can you say something for our readers as to explain why it is that emojis can be used to make a terroristic threat when under the terms of the New York statutes introduced against terrorism following 9/11, this only viewed threats as being possible via language. And so from that perspective, I started thinking about emoji. And myself, I didn't know that much about emoji. And I realized that emoji is fulfilling the same communicative functions that language fulfills. And there are basically 2 of them. The first is that language has to represent an idea. So in English, we take the 3 sound segments, cat, and we all know as English speakers, we all agree as a community of English speakers that if you sequence those 3 sounds together, that will refer to the pet of choice for many people in Western households. The second function of language, the communicative function, is the interactive function. We use language to perform things. So an obvious example of this is when a member of the clergy or someone who has the civil authority to do so can pronounce 2 individuals, husband and wife, for example, in a heterosexual marriage ceremony. And those words change the tax status, the moral obligational status of those 2 individuals, their conjugal rights status, how society views them. That status is changed not by the signature of signing the marriage register or whatever it happens to be in whichever jurisdiction one is based in, but it's the words themselves, and that's called the Speech Act. And we do that all the time. If I say to someone, please shut the door on the way out, I'm trying to influence their behavior in an aspect of the world to suit my own wishes using language. So we interact with the world. And that's exactly what the emojis were doing. They were conveying a meaning, and they were trying to, according to the New York District Attorney, trying to influence others to go around shooting police officers in the light of the grievance that this young man had with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement. So that was the analysis, and from there I then wrote a book called The Emoji Code that was published. This was back in those days before I was an indie author. I actually had a literary agent, and I published with the big 5 traditional publishers. This was published in the US by Picador Macmillan. and did really well. But then it was a next step from there to start thinking, okay, now I'm doing language technology, figuring out the future of language. And you can't then do that. If you want to talk about the future of language, you can't then do that if you're doing it from a research perspective, because you've got to take the status quo and the state of the art and figure out what's going to happen next. And the thing that interested me was what are the kinds of things that were happening to emoji started happening to language. One thing that's happened to emoji is that it's not owned by people, but it's owned by big tech. So proprietary, so it's basically Apple and Microsoft and so on. An institution, an NGO called Unicode that is based in California determines what are the permitted emojis that we have on our smartphones and tablet computers and so on. It's not us as individuals. And in 2016, this organization decided that it was no longer going to populate the handgun emoji with a handgun, but was going to turn it into a water pistol, a harmless child's toy. And in a way, whatever one thinks about gun crime, and I know particularly in the US this is a very heated topic and for good reason, but whatever one thinks about that, this is a form of censorship. The other thing that got me interested in the future of language and the move then with the Babel apocalypse to think about the downstream consequences of language streaming technology, which is really what the book is about, was then warnings from 2015 onwards by many of the world's leading computer scientists that in the future humans face an existential threat potentially from the rise of AI. Now we're seeing that. You opened right at the beginning by talking about ChatGPT and the kind of ethical and problematic issues that we're seeing now with authorship and so on. And I wanted to ask the question, well, if we have smart AI becoming as powerful and more powerful than human intellects, and then we have a sort of a rebuttal of that or a move against that to hybridize the human mind, which is what someone like Elon Musk has been trying to do and others like him with his Neurolink startup. So the idea there is that we can use new technology to implant neuroprosthetic chips in the human brain to enhance the human brain. And from Elon Musk's perspective, this, in the first instance, has a medical benefit, but ultimately he wants to create transhumans, so people with smart microcomputers in their heads to allow us to compete with smart AI so we don't get left behind, we don't get wiped out. So if you have this technology, what would the consequences be? So back in 2020, Elon Musk predicted that language will be obsolete, language learning will be obsolete in 5 to 10 years. Now that's wrong. But I took that idea, the idea had already formulated because I started writing the book in 2019 before he made that wild prediction, and asked myself, what if language in the future is just like music, is just like movies, in the sense that we can stream it over the internet? With the advent of internet ecosystem from space, which is being developed, so we have massively powerful broadband connections 24/7 from space that encircle the Earth. And in a future, in around 100 years, the technology will exist that we have potentially language chip implants that allow us to stream language without ever having to have learned it. We already, since about 2010, 2012, scientists have been able to map how the brain, electrical impulses from the brain, produce language, even in the absence of the articulatory abilities. So what that means is if someone, for whatever reason, suffers some kind of injury, so they can't produce using their vocal apparatus language, their brain can still think the language, and this can be picked up by an artificial synthesizer to produce those basically read thoughts using a neuroprosthetic implant. So in the future, if we have this technology, what are the consequences? So the Babel apocalypse asks this kind of what-if question. It takes the prospect, the highly probable prospect of the technology existing by the end of this century, that we can have language chips. We don't need to learn it anymore at the mother's breast, so to speak. So you lose your mother tongue, and you can stream it as you think and talk from internet and space. What would be the consequences of that? And the book starts with this apocalyptic event, a global language outage. So just like we have an electricity outage or whatever it might be, or an internet outage, if you have evil corporations or if you have hackers or whatever it might be, and you have this global event that's highly unlikely, it's low probability, but one for which the planet is completely unprepared because the entire ecosystem of people, you no longer have native speakers, they're dependent on streaming language. What would happen? What would be the consequences? And that's the premise of the book. So that's sort of my background, my story. You asked what my background was and how it led me to this particular project.
That is so fascinating. Oh my gosh. Like and terrifying too. Oh my gosh, Viv. That's
Indeed.
like so the idea of language being streamed into your mind, would that be like a
Mm-hmm.
conversation like you and I are having? Would that be a bunch of images, I guess? Or would it be language that you're thinking without any verbal aspect to it?
So what I've done is I've made some assumptions, but I'm starting from current technology. So this is based on, so this is a work of hard science fiction, in the sense that I'm being realistic, given what is current the state of the art in terms of research. And by the way, Neurolink, Elon Musk's startup venture that is investigating these neuroprosthetic implants, recently received approval from the FDA for in the US for human testing. So this is now moving forward at pace. But in terms of your question, what would this look like? You would need a language chip that has this technology to be resilient in a wet, messy environment, namely the human brain. It would need to connect as a minimum to the two language areas of the brain. Most people don't realize that the brain has language areas. It has what's called the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. The Broca's area is the part of the brain that produces language. So when I'm speaking now, that connects with all the muscle systems, the mouth, the different parts of the articulatory elements, the tongue and the esophagus and so on, that allows me to produce spoken language. And then what I'm doing when I'm listening to your questions and what you're doing now is your Wernicke's area is lighting up, and that's processing and comprehending because you're a native speaker of English. You can understand what I'm saying despite my weird accent. Where I come from, by the way, I don't have an accent, so that's funny. That's cool.
It's a wonderful accent. I love it, by the way.
Thank you, thank you,
I like it. Yeah.
thank you. So you have this language chip that connects the different parts of the brain. It would also have to connect with areas that allow us to draw down concepts. And concepts for different things that we experience are widely distributed across the brain. There's not one area of the brain that holds concepts. So the visual part of the brain stores concepts for things that we see, like dogs and birds, and identifies their shapes. The amygdala, which is an older part of the brain, that stores concepts and experiences relating to emotion. So language then hooks up to these different things so we can actually, because what we're doing when we use language, whatever language it happens to be, Swahili, Japanese, French, English, it doesn't matter. So we're basically symbolizing, we're using a symbol, so something that's physical, in this case sound, but it could be writing, that's also physical, or it could be a sign gestures and sign languages. We're using a physical signal to encode and externalize a concept so that you understand what it is I'm trying to get across to you. That's what language basically is. So the language chip would connect to those different elements of the brain. And then you would need a transceiver. So this is the stuff that people like Elon Musk's team are working on, probably behind the ear. So you can get the Wi-Fi signal from the internet and space ecosystem that connects through something equivalent to Bluetooth to the language chip. Then what you would have is you'd have the ability to, rather than using the mental store, what's called the lexicon that we have in our minds when we learn a language, to know which words hook up in whichever language it happens to be to the ideas that you want to express. You don't have to learn language anymore. So if you imagine, I don't know if you speak any other languages, or how many languages you might speak, whether you've tried to learn any languages, maybe at school or whatever back in the day, it's a hard process. Learning French or German or whatever it happens to be, learning what the different words are in those languages. It's a laborious, painstaking process, and you have to build a new mental lexicon in your head, so basically a dictionary, so that it's as comfortable ultimately as speaking English. We don't need to think about it. You're just drawing down the words from this dictionary basically you have in your head. You wouldn't have that anymore. You wouldn't need to learn the language, not even as a kid, because what would happen is your thoughts would pick up whichever lexicon you were subscribing to. So say you subscribe to Apple Music or whatever it happens to be, and you can get as much music as you want per month. It would be the same kind of thing. You would have a monthly subscription that you pay for. You would, if you lived in the United States, then for many people, English would be the language to subscribe to. You could subscribe to a multi-lexical package if you wanted Spanish as well, or some other languages. More languages would cost. If you have a multi-package, that would be more expensive. Most people would probably just stick to one language and they would just stream it. But say you wanted to go to Japan, you could then get a Japanese package on top of the English one, and just start streaming Japanese. Using whatever ideas you happen to want to convey, you'll be able to stream them. And so the advantage of this kind of technology is that it doesn't limit aspiration. You have complete leveling up. You're only constrained by how much you can afford. So you could go to Japan, you could fall in love with a man or a woman from Japan, you could work in Japan without any problems anymore. Say you wanted to be a rocket scientist or a tort lawyer or an astrophysicist. You could download a specialist lexical package and you'd know all the terms that you need, that you could hook up then to the concept, so you'd be able to express yourself and do those kinds of jobs. The disadvantage of this kind of system, however, is that you have a unique IP address, just like you do with a computer, that's linked to the language chip. So with this kind of system, basically, you are a homing beacon continuously, because you're basically just like a smart computer, your smart telephone. You are but constantly beaming to internet and basically privacy is gone forever. There's a forever record of who you've been with, where you are. So the advantage of this from a state perspective is that you, at a stroke, eliminate crime. You can identify who's done what when, who they've been with and where. From the user perspective, the advantage is that you have voice command technology. So because you've got this unique, in the book it's called a SEC code, which stands for security code, so a unique 15-digit number that's unique to the language chip, and that is transmitted every time you speak via metadata in speech over the Wi-Fi signal. So you can get into your house, your car, your office, into your retail venue, just by speaking through voice commands to a microphone in the door, which are called in the book VERDAs, which stands for Virtual Digital Assistant, and you have perfect security. So theft is eliminated, and equally perpetrators of crime can be detected instantly. So it's kind of like better than the Minority Report. You don't have to figure out what's going on in the future. There's a forever record of everyone. But then, of course, you have issues with civil liberty, potential censorship. So one example of censorship would be this. In a particular state, say for argument's sake the United States, something like abortion, whatever one feels about abortion, say for argument's sake that abortion is outlawed under all circumstances, then the state can decide in that jurisdiction to eliminate or proscribe the word abortion. So users of English in that particular jurisdiction can no longer, you've cancelled the word. This is cancel culture at the level of language. The word is cancelled, so people can't express the idea, they can't even think about it. And you then have the Kafkaesque situation that, say, in parts of Europe, say in England, abortion hasn't been outlawed. When you switch, if you fly across the Atlantic, you travel across the Atlantic, you go to that jurisdiction, you can suddenly access it and stream it and talk about the concept again. So, and you can see that if people have got computers in their heads, these language chips, then the cyber terrorism and hacking become problems potentially. You have issues of censorship, you have issues of overreach by the state. Authoritarian regimes can, for their own ends and purposes, change the law or massage the law so that certain lexical choices are removed. You have a situation that's even worse than George Orwell's 1984 with Newspeak and Thought Crime and so on.
I was just about to bring
and,
up 1984. Yeah. Gosh.
Yeah, and this is a real potential scenario given this technology, and this is exactly what the book explores. The book explores it. The mouthpiece of the mouthpiece of this warning, basically, which is what the book amounts to, is Professor Eva Black. She's one of the two main protagonists in the book. She remains, through a loophole in the law, she remains the last unchipped native speaker of language anywhere in the automated world. She doesn't have a language chip.
Wow.
She's a polyglot.
Yeah.
She's a professor of linguistics, and she leads a resistance movement against this state-controlled system. And the other issue that's interesting is that states would naturally, in this kind of hypothetical future, would want to ensure that all the population don't go what's called feral in the book. Basically, they can function and they're functional members of society. So what states would do typically would have a single language that's accessible on all the public VERDA systems, these virtual digital assistant systems that provide access to homes, offices, cars, retail stores, and so on, where you can identify yourself through a voice command, which reads the metadata, the SEC code, the IP address in your head. So in the United States, it's conceivable under such an arrangement that English would be the language that was selected, that is the single public language that's used on all these systems, which means, from the benefit of people who are on lower incomes, that they only have to have a single lexical package, because multiple lexical packages with more languages that might include Spanish and French and whatever are more expensive to stream. So you, as a safety net, you just have one language. So you have this kind of situation, and it's ripe for disaster. It's ripe for this kind of slippery slope situation where things can be prescribed. You can have vetting of words, which means their removal. You can have kind of the quasi-censorship, which is what's happened to emoji. And in this hypothetical future imagined in the Babel apocalypse, everything starts with California. So there's a public referendum 100 years hence, and the population is asked, do they want to begin a process of mandatory language chipping? And then you go through a transitional generational phase that after 18 years, once every adult has been chipped, after 18 years, all newborns then must, by law, undergo language chipping. So within a generation, you no longer have any native speakers of language left. So then you're entirely dependent upon big tech, and anything that goes wrong, which is what happens in the Babel apocalypse, which is a language outage, causes absolute disaster and catastrophe for civilization.
You know, I am reminded of Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and it seems like a lot of folks here in North America, they're constantly looking towards the government as a threat to their freedoms and the definition of what it means to be a human being. But in the book Fahrenheit 451, it wasn't the government that started burning books. It was groups of people. It was these social groups that didn't like certain types of books, and they started to burn them. And
they did.
And everything that you just described is a concept that Andrew Gillsmith, another guest that I've had on this show, that he described to me, this unholy alliance of big money capital, tech, and corporation. And they're the ones that's really driving all of this. I mean, it isn't really coming from the government. The government now, the nation state, is starting to become downstream of technology and capital now. wherever you have capital and technology, then you have the shot caller of the nation state now. And I
Yes,
mean,
indeed.
it's some really, really scary stuff out there. Yeah, I mean, it's some scary stuff. So,
I,
um, and so my question then is this: it's like a lot of the motivators of transhumanism and folks that want to make us into cyborgs, essentially, is ideas that if we can marry the human brain to this emergent technology to
mhm,
make us more competitive with AI. Would that really make us competitive with this
mhm.
super intelligence, assuming it reaches that level? And B, um, I have a sneaky feeling that it's going to be a lot easy to scale intelligence through an AI program than it is to figure out the neurolinks in a human brain. But am I completely off track on that? Or what are your thoughts on that? Mhm.
Well, just going back to Gil Smith's work, I know you're probably referring to things like, I mean, his writing is so cool, Our Lady of the Artilects and so on.
Oh yes,
And
yes I am.
just
Yeah.
just going back to that for a second, I mean, one of the important points he makes in that book is a critique in part of, there are lots of different critiques, but one in part is the Chinese region and the cultural genocide that's taking place to some of the demographics there. And China is, in a way, there's been a real life example of the Ray Bradbury book that you began with
Yeah,
in terms
yeah,
of
yeah.
burning books, because of course under Chairman Mao and the Cultural Revolution, that is exactly what happened. And it wasn't, you rightly say, with Bradbury, it began with groups of people, but in the Chinese context, this was actually a state-sponsored endeavor to remove aspects of the past. And of course, books are a powerful artifacts and cultural emblems of the past and the future and the present as well. Um, so I think there are real life examples of this. In terms of AI and hybridization, um, I do think that this is going to happen. That the challenges are really not intractable in terms of how this works. There already exists the technology to have a a neuroprosthetic implant that won't degrade in the brain, that has sufficient bandwidth. There are several companies that have this. And what's interesting about Neurolink, which is the Elon Musk company, is that it's also developed a robotic surgical system to implant it with perfect accuracy. So you actually have that already. There are pathways in the brain that mean that you can pick up on particular pathways that provide massive control to different areas. I talked earlier about concepts being massively distributed, but you in fact have pathways that are quite centralized in terms of the brain. So you can pick up a lot of this information and have these bidirectional communicative systems so that language can reach these concepts and that are activated in different areas. The big problem I foresee at the moment is everyone's neural impulses are different; they're unique to each brain. So that is the challenge, but that will be overcome, I think. We can already map individuals' neural systems, so we can replicate what they want to say by reading their brain thoughts. And then, as I mentioned with voicegram technology earlier in our discussion, that technology already exists. So I do foresee. I mean, Elon Musk can often be bombastic and problematic in a range of ways. Talking about Twitter, that's one example of a dumpster fire, perhaps for some people at least, in terms of management. But his claim that language will be obsolete or language learning will be obsolete in 5 to 10 years is plainly just wrong and sensationalist. And maybe that was the point. I don't know. But it's certainly the technology will exist. That's for certain. And a lot of people, or at least some people, do view creating a hybridized mind where we become basically cyborgs as a way of staying ahead and avoiding the existential threat that perhaps others fear from very smart AI. The question then, the philosophical question I think that's interesting then is, Well, if we're complaining now about things like ChatGPT, replacing authors, replacing art, creating book covers using AI, or actually books that might potentially in the future become masterpieces generated by AI, what then happens if you've got a hybridized human mind that's actually taking advantage of some of these developments to do exactly that? If language is no longer owned by people, it's no longer learned, it's no longer acquired as a baby. By the age of 4, most cognitively normal children the world over speak at least one mother tongue. By the age of 4, a kid that can't ride a bicycle or tie its shoelaces is a linguistic genius, which is quite a remarkable thing. What happens if we strip that out? Have we replaced Chat GPT with ourselves? And we're not really artists anymore. We're using chips in our heads to help. The other issue is that there would need to be, to control all this stuff, you would need a body-born computing system. And in the Babel apocalypse, that's imagined as a wrist chip that's connected to the ear transceiver and the language chip in the brain. And that allows us to project what's called a holotab, which is a holographic translucent screen that's controlled with eye-tech fusion technology, which is actually we're starting to see. So you can blink command things on your computer and so on. So this would be like a portable tablet that you can hibernate, and the projection shuts down. It's 18 centimeters wide. You can think of it as a sort of holographic tablet computer that you house in a chip in your wrist. That would allow you to control the language chip and whichever language setting you want. So you could subscribe to new languages, or if you cross a national state line or a national border, you can stream a different language by upgrading your monthly subscription and so on. So you've got all these other things that we have to take into account and think about. But in terms of the question, I think the technology will exist, and there will be some significant challenges other than the censorship challenge, the civil liberty challenge. It's also a very real philosophical dilemma, I think. We might become, when we have Chat GPT in our heads, what does that make us?
We could be the next evolutionary step on the planet. I mean, would we be a human being then at that point? I mean, we would have to. What is it? Homo erectus, Neanderthal, Homo sapien, and then what? Homo cyberic. I don't know. It's kind of like, but then again, I mean, the transhumanist ideal is that's exactly what they want to do. They see themselves as, I guess, producing humans as the next evolutionary step. And I have some extremely mixed feelings about Chat GPT, namely because I see folks who have never tried to write before are getting into the water now, and they're totally using it as a crutch. And they're like, well, research is difficult, so I'm going to, turn to the machine to tell me, how a nuclear submarine works. Well, writing dialogue with conflict is difficult, so I'm going to rely on the machine. And I can see a standard template construct emerging from AI for stories now. And so it's like already the future is being shaped by this technology, and it's kind of unsettling. I mean, it's totally unsettling. Do you think that artificial intelligence, and I know this is a very philosophically loaded question, but do you think it could ever obtain consciousness or become a sentient being? And I don't know what your broader worldview is, but are we ever going to see something where, a machine says, I am, or wake up, I guess, for lack of a better term?
I mean, I think the issue is that you can have a synthetic consciousness that actually simulates consciousness. So there was a story recently where in the United States there was some war gaming going on in the Pentagon, and in the war game, the AI killed the generals, the commanders of the war game, because they were preventing it from achieving the scores that it had it was supposed to achieve in terms of whatever the war gaming scenario was. So it
Okay,
saw
we need to
the
stop it, Luke.
human.
We need to stop the AI development. Oh my gosh, it
So I
eliminated
mean,
the generals.
yeah, because
Sorry,
they
sorry.
were.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have the, going back to people like Isaac Asimov in the
Mm.
Robot series of books and stories from like the 1940s onwards, with the ethics of AI, thou shalt not harm humans, and so on. And talking again about Andrew Gilsmith, just alluding to his work, he has this very similar or analogous, very interesting idea of pruning that he discusses with the artilects, the synths, in his book, Our Lady of the Artilects, where the synths have to go through this process of pruning to sort of game them and to test that they can act in a rational and moral way and be safe to be used around humans. So I think it's potentially. I think this issue of consciousness is the wrong way of thinking about it. I think you can simulate that computer code is not the same as a human brain. It can achieve identical results, even better results than a human brain, using different means because it's using mechanical, robotic, AI means to achieve the same thing. So you can have a level of consciousness that is not quite the same as human consciousness that achieves similar kind of results. And I think this goes back, to the idea of the Turing test after the famous British mathematician who asked, is it possible for humans to simulate consciousness? And the test for this is whether you can have a conversation with them without realizing you're in fact having a conversation with a computer. And the answer is yes. That is becoming clear that is possible. So it's a different type of phenomenon that we're dealing with. It's not consciousness in terms of the synapses and cells, the wet matter of a human brain that's producing it. The brain evolved originally to control a body and make sure the body stayed alive. But there are simulations of this that would achieve exactly the same effects, pass the Turing test. And then we have synthetic thought and synthetic consciousness that's achieved in a different way. So I do think that this is probably inevitable. I think that hybridized human minds are inevitable. And I hope something like the Babel apocalypse and its dire predictions are not inevitable. But language is power, language is control. So one of the key messages, the slogans from Ebba Black, the protagonist of the Babel apocalypse, is that they who control language control everything. Language is the hallmark of what it means to be human. We fall in love, we convince people to vote for us or not vote for us. We get divorced using language. We use language to transact and enact our daily lives, to make friends, to influence people. Advertisers use it to woo us and to get us to buy their goods and their items. You don't have to be a Shakespeare to know how to use language. We are all geniuses at it. And it takes the kind of the Shakespearean feats of the extraordinary to reveal many things actually about the ordinary that we all do all the time. And I think without language, we're nothing. But I do think the things that are neuroprosthetic implants, synthetic consciousness, I do think they are inevitable. The world's on the verge of the fourth industrial revolution, sometimes abbreviated to 4IR. And this is a revolution that involves connectivity, smart AI, and the Internet of Things. I've briefly alluded to an open letter published in 2015 earlier in our discussion. And this was signed by many of the world's leading computer scientists, as well as other leading scientists. Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, who was a very famous British astrophysicist, was a signatory, as was, interestingly, Elon Musk. And what this letter said is that, and it was accompanied by a short report, is that given the advent of the world's fourth industrial revolution, we do need to have strict controls and policies in place to prevent existential threats to human beings. And that doesn't just mean, something like the Terminator series where Skynet blows up the human race because they see the humans as a threat, which actually, ironically, mirrors the situation that I talked about with respect to the Pentagon's wargaming situation. But also things like employment. The second book in the series, The Babel Apocalypse, is the first book of a 6-book series called Songs of the Sage. Now, the second book, which is coming out next year, is called The Dark Court. And that takes the idea, all the books in the series look at the idea of language as a potential weapon of mass destruction if in the wrong hands. But one of the central conceits of The Dark Court next year is that employment in the future will be a thing of the past because of automation and AI, and all manual jobs in the automated world will be eliminated. And then what do you do with all the what are called unskilled? You have a caste system based on IQ, and if you're an unskilled, you're permanently unemployed, and the state has to look after you with federal schemes to make sure you have a minimum wage because you're never going to work. But then what happens to these people that have no kind of purpose as a consequence of automation? So an existential threat needn't just be, something dramatic like Skynet and Terminator trying to destroy the human race, but also these kinds of issues. What happens in the future when you have no work anymore? So what would Bruce Springsteen have to sing about, if all the workers have been laid off, for example?
You bring up a really, really good point too. Whenever you bring up the existential threat of AI, a lot of people, there is this cognitive dissonance, and I think that's why it's been ignored for so long. But the bleak world of unemployment, of the financial impact, and not only that, but anyone who's watching this, to the vast audience that is watching Reader's Labyrinth, if you're thinking to yourself, well, my job is safe, I'm a lawyer. Well, my job is safe, I'm a brain surgeon. I'm sure there's an AI program right now that's gunning for you. It may not be written yet. It may be in the past that's in front of us, or the future that's behind us, right? Like that tribe in South America. But I can't think of a human endeavor now that AI could not replicate and do better. And because if you can scale up intelligence enough, then there is no white collar job. There is no creative job that it's not going to be able to do better. And so, yeah, what do you do with the surplus human beings? And I had another guest on a while back, and he said, which I'm not trying to like name drop another guest as I'm talking to someone, but he said, what if it's like Arthur C. Clarke's It's Childhood's End, where, hey, this is just where this phase of humanity ends, and this is the next chapter. Don't try and fight it, but this is where we end, in the new intelligent species on our planet is going to be silicone based. It's because even if you have a hybrid, unless there's massive genetic modification going on, I don't see how a hybrid, we might be able to compete with an AI for a couple of decades, but eventually that intelligence is going to scale up. So,
yes,
I don't know. And so I'm sure that you've heard of the Fermi paradox, right? And one of the solutions to the Fermi paradox is that all biological carbon-based life gives way to silicone intelligence, this artificial intelligence. And then after a couple of generations, that artificial intelligence, it physically scales down to a microscopic level. That's why, like, when you look out at the universe, you wouldn't really see it, or you wouldn't see like a Dyson swarm or something like that. But
yeah.
Viv, it has been a blast. I need to get going. I'm about 30 minutes over, but this was gold. Oh my gosh, this is gold. I cannot wait to get into your book. Oh man, it certainly has. Thank you so much. Yes, fantastic. This is definitely going to be a classic way up there. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolute pleasure. And thank you for having me.
Of course, of course.